Admiral Lisa Monroe boarded the neutral vessel alone. She had refused to bring guards or weapons. If the meeting was a trap, she would die. But she did not believe it was a trap. She had heard something in Vextheel's message that sounded like genuine curiosity, and maybe something like regret. The High Arbiter waited in a small conference room with plain walls and simple furniture. He looked older than she remembered. His gray skin had lost its shine. His 4 eyes were tired and sad. He rose slowly when she entered and gestured for her to sit. They sat across from each other in silence for a long moment. 2 enemies who had nearly destroyed each other. 2 leaders who held the fate of billions in their hands. Vexthel spoke first. He asked the question that had haunted him since the day humanity laughed at his ultimatum. How could they face death without fear? How could they refuse surrender when they knew it meant destruction? What was wrong with them? Monroe smiled. It was the same warm smile that Griffin had shown at the surrender ceremony. She told Vexthel that he had it backwards. Humans were not fearless. They were terrified. Every single person on Earth had been afraid when his fleet appeared in their sky. But fear of death was not the worst thing a human could experience. She told him about human history. She told him about the empires that had risen and fallen on their small blue world. She told him about the tyrants who had conquered nations and the slaves who had eventually overthrown them. She told him about the Dark Ages that had nearly ended their civilization and the renaissances that had brought them back. Humans had been conquered before. They had been enslaved and oppressed and nearly destroyed. But they had always risen again. They had learned, through thousands of years of suffering, that some things were worth more than survival. Freedom was one of those things. Dignity was another. The right to choose their own destiny was the most important of all. Vexthel listened without interrupting. His species had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years. They had never been conquered. They had never been oppressed. They had never had to fight for their freedom, because they had always been the ones taking freedom from others. He had never understood what that experience did to a species. He had never understood the fire it created inside them. Monroe continued. She explained that humanity had laughed at his ultimatum because they had heard threats like it before. Every tyrant in human history had made the same promises. Surrender or die. Submit or be destroyed. Resistance is futile. And every single one of those tyrants had eventually fallen. Humans had learned something that the hegemony never understood. Power based on fear was fragile. Empires built on conquest always collapsed. The only thing that lasted was connection. The only thing that endured was trust. The only way to build something permanent was to build it together. That was why humanity had spent decades making alliances with oppressed species. That was why they had offered friendship instead of demanding submission. That was why they had fought for a galaxy where every species was equal, instead of trying to become the new rulers. Vexthel was quiet for a long time. He stared at his hands, gray and weathered by centuries of life. Those hands had signed orders that destroyed civilizations. Those hands had built an empire on the suffering of countless beings. He made a decision. The next day, High Arbiter Vexthel broadcast a message to every world in Council space. He spoke for nearly an hour. He admitted that the hegemony had been wrong. Not just about Earth, but about everything. He described the atrocities his species had committed. He named the civilizations they had destroyed. He acknowledged the suffering they had caused. Then he called for the council to dissolve. He proposed something new in its place. A true alliance where every species had equal voice. A system based on cooperation instead of conquest. A galaxy where strength meant building others up instead of tearing them down. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The hegemony leadership tried to have him arrested, but their own military refused to act. Soldiers who had served the Empire for generations laid down their weapons. Commanders who had conquered worlds in the hegemony's name resigned their commissions. The old order collapsed within weeks, not through war or destruction, but through a cascade of choices. Species after species chose to stop supporting the system that had oppressed them. Individuals after individuals decided that they wanted something better. The Galactic Compact was established 3 months later. Representatives from over 100 species gathered to create something that had never existed before. A true alliance of equals where every voice mattered. Humanity was invited to lead the new order. They had inspired the revolution. They had built the alliances that made it possible. They had shown the galaxy a different way of being. But they refused. Secretary General Paul Griffin explained that leadership was not what humanity wanted. The whole point of their struggle had been equality. If they took power, they would become exactly what they had fought against. This choice earned humanity more respect than any military victory ever could. Admiral Monroe retired to teach at Earth's Naval Academy. She spent her remaining years training young officers to fight for what was right instead of just what was ordered. Secretary General Griffin stepped down after the compact was established. He lived quietly on a small farm and watched his grandchildren grow up in a peaceful galaxy. Ambassador Daniel Webb became humanity's first representative to the Follies. Grow up in a peaceful galaxy. Ambassador Daniel Webb became humanity's first representative to the foe. Representative Daniel Webb became of the Narration. Grow up in a Sumaju. Daniel Webb became haunted. Daniel Webb's first representative to the compact. He spent decades building connections between species that had been enemies for millennia. Commander Rachel Torres began training operatives from other species. She taught them the same skills she had used to bring down the hegemony. But now those skills would be used to prevent tyranny instead of fighting it. Arbiter Vexthol lived out his remaining years on Earth. He wrote a detailed history of his species' crimes as a warning to future generations. He visited schools and spoke to children about the importance of choosing connection over conquest. 10 years passed. A young hegemony child sat with her grandfather in a garden on Earth. She asked him a question that had been bothering her. Why had the humans laughed when his people threatened them? Why were they not afraid? The grandfather was Vexthol, old now beyond measure. He smiled, something his species had only recently learned to do. He told her that humans had understood, something his people had forgotten. Hope was stronger than fear. Freedom was worth any price, and no one, no matter how powerful, could take those things away unless you let them. The child nodded seriously. She did not fully understand, but she would remember. Above them, ships from dozens of species moved peacefully through Earth's sky. They were building something new together. A civilization based on trust instead of terror. An alliance that grew stronger because it lifted everyone up instead of pushing others down. Floating in orbit was a simple monument. A plaque commemorating the day humanity refused to surrender. Its inscription was read by beings from across the galaxy who came to see the world that had changed everything. The words were simple. They demanded our surrender. We offered our friendship. The choice was always theirs. And far below, on a small blue world that had once been threatened with destruction, children of 100 species played together in the sunlight. They did not know about the war. They did not remember the fear. They only knew that the galaxy was a place where everyone belonged. That was enough. That was everything. 6 weeks had passed since the Council demanded Earth's surrender. The corrective fleet still drifted in the solar system, but it was no longer a threat. It had become something else entirely. It had become a hostage. The ships were running low on supplies. Their crews were tired and confused. Some captains had tried to attack Earth on their own and been destroyed by their own malfunctioning weapons. Others had attempted to flee and found their navigation systems leading them in circles. Most simply waited and hoped that someone would come to save them. No one came. The Galactic Council was fracturing. Species that had joined out of fear were now reconsidering their loyalty. Species that had been conquered were remembering old grievances. Species that had never liked hegemony dominance were sensing opportunity. Elder Vethkai watched the chaos from his hidden refuge on a moon that the Council had forgotten. He was ancient beyond human understanding, one of the last survivors of his species near extinction. 3 centuries ago, the hegemony had burned the Veth-Ari homeworld to ash. They had hunted the survivors across the galaxy. They had tried to erase his people from existence, but the Veth-Ari had survived. They had hidden and waited and remembered. And now, thanks to humanity, they were rising again. Council member Threlanak of the Sindari watched the same chaos from very different surroundings. He sat in his comfortable office on the council station, surrounded by luxury and privilege. He had served the council faithfully for 60 years. He had believed in the system, believed that order required control, believed that some species were simply meant to rule others. Now, he was not so sure. He had seen the evidence that human agents had gathered. He had seen the records of species destroyed and cultures erased. He had seen the truth behind the peaceful facade of galactic civilization. And he had begun to wonder if there might be a better way. Secretary General Paul Griffin traveled to neutral space for secret negotiations. He was accompanied by Ambassador Daniel Webb and a small team of diplomats. They met with representatives of species that were still undecided, still trying to figure out which side to support. Griffin made humanity's position clear. Earth did not want to rule the galaxy. They did not want to replace the Council with a human empire. They wanted something that had never existed before. They wanted a true alliance of equals where every species had a voice. They wanted to end the cycle of conquest and submission that had defined galactic history. Some species believed him. Others did not. But all of them listened. The hegemony leadership was desperate. Their empire was crumbling. Their fleets were paralyzed. Their subject species were rising up. They needed to do something dramatic to restore order. They needed to remind the galaxy why everyone had feared them. Deep in a hidden facility, they activated something that had been kept secret for millennia. It was a weapon from an earlier age, built by the hegemony's ancestors when they first began their conquests. It was a planet killer, capable of destroying an entire world with a single shot. They aimed it at Earth. Commander Rachel Torres received the intelligence from a Veth-Ari spy who had infiltrated the facility. She had less than 12 hours to stop the weapon from firing. If she failed, Earth would die. Everyone she knew, everyone she loved, every human who had ever lived would be gone. She gathered a team of volunteers, 12 humans and 8 Veth-Ari, who were willing to give their lives for a chance at stopping the weapon. They boarded a small ship and raced toward the hidden facility at maximum speed. The mission was supposed to be impossible. The facility was heavily guarded. The weapon was protected by layers of security. Even if they reached it, they might not be able to disable it in time. Torres did not care about the odds. She had spent 15 years fighting against the Council in the shadows. She had watched good people die for the cause of freedom. She had promised herself that their deaths would mean something. Now she would keep that promise. The assault on the facility was brutal and bloody. Torres lost 6 team members in the first 5 minutes. They fought through corridors filled with enemy soldiers. They disabled security systems with equipment that barely worked. They pushed forward through pain and exhaustion and fear. With 20 minutes remaining, Torres reached the weapons control room. 4 of her team members were still alive. They worked frantically to disable the firing mechanism while enemy reinforcements pounded on the sealed door behind them. The weapon shut down with 3 minutes to spare. Torres slumped against the wall, covered in blood that was mostly not her own. She had lost 8 people on this mission. Good soldiers. Good friends. They had given their lives so that Earth could survive. News of the hegemony's attempted genocide spread across the galaxy within hours. Species that had been neutral suddenly chose sides. The hegemony had always denied using planet-killing weapons. They had always claimed to be civilized and merciful. Now, everyone knew the truth. 3 more council species defected to the growing coalition. Military commanders who had served the hegemony for generations resigned in disgust. Even some hegemony citizens began to question everything they had been taught. High Arbiter Vexthil sat alone in his quarters aboard the crippled flagship. His species had built an empire that lasted 10,000 years. His ancestors had conquered 400 civilizations. His people had believed they were destined to rule the galaxy forever. Now it was all falling apart. He sent a private message to Admiral Monroe. He did not send it as the High Arbiter of the hegemony. He sent it as an individual, a tired old being who had seen too much suffering and caused too much pain. He wanted to meet with her. He wanted to understand how humanity could face extinction with a laugh. He wanted to know what drove them to fight against impossible odds. Monroe read the message and considered her response. Part of her wanted to refuse. The hegemony had tried to destroy her world. They had killed her people. They had threatened everything she loved. But another part of her remembered why humanity was fighting. They were not fighting for revenge. They were fighting for a better galaxy. And that meant giving even their enemies a chance to change. She agreed to meet. The war was entering a new phase. Not a phase of battles and destruction, but a phase of choices and consequences. The galaxy was watching to see what would happen next. And for the first time in millennia, anything seemed possible. The massive crystalline ship appeared in Earth's orbit without any warning on a cold Tuesday morning in the year 2247. It was 3 kilometers long, and it looked like nothing humanity had ever built. Every television screen, every phone, every computer on the planet suddenly showed the same image. A tall gray creature with 4 eyes and skin like polished stone stared down at the people of Earth. Admiral Lisa Monroe stood on the bridge of her command ship and watched the alien vessel hover above their world. She was 58 years old and had spent her entire life preparing for something like this. Her fleet of 47 ships held position near the moon, waiting for orders that might never come. The alien ship was bigger than all of them combined. The creature on every screen began to speak. Its voice was cold and empty, like wind through dead trees. It called itself High Arbiter Vexthil of the hegemony, and it spoke on behalf of the Galactic Council. The message was simple. Earth had 72 hours to surrender. Secretary General Paul Griffin watched the broadcast from his office in Geneva. He was 64 years old with gray hair and tired eyes that had seen too many crises. But he had never seen anything like this. The alien explained that humanity had expanded too aggressively into space. Their 12 colony worlds were a threat to galactic stability. Their unpredictable nature made them dangerous. The terms were clear. Earth would give up all its colonies. Earth would destroy its military fleet. Earth would accept something called protective integration into hegemony territory. If Earth refused, the Council would take corrective action. The alien did not explain what corrective action meant, but the threat was obvious. Ambassador Daniel Webb arrived at the emergency meeting within the hour. He was 45 years old and had spent the last decade dealing with minor galactic affairs. He knew things about the Council that most humans did not. He knew that they had conquered over 400 civilizations in their 10,000-year history. He knew that no species at humanity's level of development had ever refused their demands. He knew that the council believed resistance was impossible. The meeting room was full of generals and admirals and politicians. Everyone was shouting. Some wanted to fight. Some wanted to surrender. Some wanted to negotiate. Paul Griffin listened to all of them and said nothing. He was waiting for one person to speak. Admiral Monroe's face appeared on the main screen. She was still aboard her command ship, still watching the alien vessel. She asked a simple question that silenced everyone in the room. Who said anything about conventional warfare? The room went quiet. Monroe explained that humanity had known about the Galactic Council for decades. Ever since first contact with a small trading species 20 years ago, they had been learning. They had discovered that the galaxy was not a friendly place. They had discovered that powerful species preyed upon weaker ones. They had discovered that one day, someone would come for Earth. So they had prepared. Not with ships and weapons. The Council had thousands of warships for every one of Earth's vessels. Building more would be pointless. Instead, humanity had built something else. They had built networks. They had built alliances. They had built a web of secrets that stretched across Council space. Ambassador Webb took over the explanation. For 15 years, human agents had been quietly making contact with species the Council had conquered. The Vethari, whose homeworld had been burned to ash 3 centuries ago. The Kaldan, who had been forced into servitude as laborers. The remnant, scattered survivors of a dozen dead civilizations. All of them remembered what the Council had done. All of them wanted revenge. Paul Griffin asked the question everyone was thinking. Could they really fight the Council? Could they really win? Monroe answered honestly. She did not know if they could win, but she knew they could make the Council bleed. She knew they could inspire others to rise up. She knew they could show the galaxy that resistance was possible. And she knew that surrender meant the end of everything humanity had ever been. Griffin nodded slowly. He was an old man who had lived a long life. He had grandchildren on the colony worlds. He had friends and family scattered across 12 planets. He thought about what would happen to them under hegemony rule. Oh, he thought about the 400 civilizations that had submitted before. He thought about their cultures and languages and dreams, all erased and forgotten. He made his decision. Griffin authorized the activation of something called Protocol Defiance. It was a plan that had been in development for 20 years. It involved every secret agent humanity had placed in Council space. It involved every alliance they had built with oppressed species. It involved every piece of information they had gathered about Council weaknesses. The room erupted in activity. Generals rushed to coordinate with their forces. Admirals began issuing orders to their ships. Politicians started preparing the population for what was coming. But Admiral Monroe sat quietly on her bridge. Looking out at the stars. She thought about her daughter, who lived on the colony world of New Helsinki. She thought about her grandson, who was only 3 years old and loved to look at pictures of starships. She thought about all the children who would grow up in the galaxy they were about to create. 68 hours remained on the Council's deadline. Somewhere in the depths of Council space, human agents received encrypted signals. Resistance cells that had been sleeping for years began to wake. Oppressed species that had given up hope started to believe again. The High Arbiter's Vexthal waited in his crystalline ship, confident that Earth would submit like every other world before it. He had done this hundreds of times. He knew how the story always ended. Primitive species made threats and pleaded and begged, and then they surrendered. It was the natural order of things. He did not know that this time would be different. He did not know that humanity had been preparing for this moment. He did not know that across the galaxy, whispers were spreading about a small blue world that refused to kneel. Paul Griffin looked out his window at the night sky. Somewhere up there, an alien fleet was preparing to destroy everything he loved. But for the first time since the broadcast began, he smiled. Humanity had faced extinction before. They had survived ice ages and plagues and wars that nearly ended their species. They had climbed out of darkness again and again. They would do it one more time. The countdown continued. 67 hours remained. And on 12 colony worlds, billions of humans looked up at the stars and waited to learn their fate. None of them knew what was coming. None of them knew about protocol defiance or the secret alliances or the networks of spies. But all of them knew one thing: they would not go quietly. 3 days after the ultimatum expired, the corrective fleet entered Earth's solar system. 10,000 warships emerged from faster-than-light travel near the orbit of Neptune. They stretched across the darkness of space like an endless wall of metal and fury. Each ship was larger than anything humanity had ever built. Together they carried enough firepower to burn a dozen worlds to ash. Admiral Lisa Monroe watched them come from the bridge of her command ship, the Perseverance. Her fleet of 47 vessels held position near Mars, seemingly preparing for a hopeless last stand. Every captain under her command had volunteered to stay. Every crew member understood they would probably not survive the day. But Monroe was smiling. The Council fleet advanced in perfect formation. Their commanders were confident and eager. This would be a simple operation. Crush the tiny human fleet, bombard the colonies into submission, then reduce Earth itself to rubble as a warning to others. The whole thing would take less than a day. Then the chaos began. Lieutenant Kevin Parks sat in a cramped room deep inside the Perseverance, surrounded by screens and keyboards. He was 29 years old and had spent his entire adult life studying alien technology. He understood their networks better than most aliens did. And right now, he was tearing those networks apart. The first ship to lose navigation was a hegemony cruiser near the front of the formation. Its systems simply stopped responding. The vessel drifted off course and collided with its neighbor. Both ships tumbled into a third. Within minutes, the perfect formation was breaking apart. Communication networks collapsed next. Commanders tried to issue orders, but heard only static. Ships that had worked together for centuries suddenly could not coordinate. Weapon systems locked onto friendly vessels instead of enemies. Engine controls reported false data that sent ships spinning in wrong directions. Dr. Maria Santos had designed this attack 20 years ago. She was 52 now and watched from a secure bunker on Earth as her creation did its work. She had spent decades studying every piece of Council technology that humanity could acquire. She had found weaknesses that the Council did not even know existed. She had built tools to exploit those weaknesses at exactly the right moment. The Council had never faced an enemy like this. Their previous conquests had been simple. Primitive species built primitive defenses and died primitive deaths. No one had ever attacked them from the inside. No one had ever turned their own technology against them. The corrective fleet ground to a halt. Ships drifted without purpose. Commanders screamed into dead communication systems. Weapons pointed in random directions. The mighty armada that was supposed to destroy Earth in hours was now helpless and confused. But this was only the beginning. Across Council space, the resistance was rising. Vethari workers who had served the hegemony for generations suddenly stopped working. 3 major shipyards fell silent as their crews walked away from their stations. Supply lines that had operated for centuries were cut by sabotage and strikes. The Kaldan were next. They had been conquered 400 years ago and forced to serve as laborers on 100 worlds. Now they remembered what freedom felt like. Kaldan workers blocked transit routes through their territory. Kaldan engineers disabled the systems they had been forced to maintain. The flow of resources that kept the Council functioning began to slow. 12 more species declared neutrality within the first day. They would not help Earth, but they would not help the Council either. Trade agreements were suspended. Military cooperation ended. The great machine of galactic conquest was falling apart. High Arbiter Vexthil stood on the bridge of his flagship and tried to understand what was happening. His officers brought him reports of disaster after disaster. The corrective fleet was stranded. Their supply lines were cut. Their communication networks were compromised. And they were facing not just the humans, but the anger of every species they had conquered. He tried to call for reinforcements. The message never arrived. He tried to contact the council leadership. There was no response. He tried to restore order to his fleet. Nothing worked. Admiral Monroe broadcast a message to the crippled armada. Her voice was calm and almost kind. She told them that their ships still worked. Their weapons still fired. But they could not coordinate. They could not resupply. They could not call for help. She told them that humanity was not going to destroy them. Humanity was simply going to wait. The council had a choice. They could drift in the darkness until their supplies ran out. They could try to attack and destroy each other in the confusion. Or they could surrender and go home. Monroe asked them to think carefully about what happened next. Vexthil felt something he had not experienced in 300 years of life. He felt afraid. His species had nearly forgotten what fear was. They had been the predators for so long that they had forgotten what it meant to be prey. A young officer brought him another report. The hegemony homeworld itself was experiencing technical difficulties. Government networks were failing. Military communications were compromised. The same attacks that had crippled his fleet were now reaching the heart of the Empire. The High Arbiter looked out at the darkness of space. Somewhere in that darkness, a small blue world was laughing at everything his civilization had built. Somewhere in that darkness, the galaxy was changing in ways he could not yet understand. He had come to Earth expecting a quick victory and an easy conquest. Instead, he had found something far more dangerous than ships or weapons. He had found a species that fought with ideas instead of force. He had found a species that built alliances instead of empires. He had found a species that inspired hope in beings who had none, and he had no idea how to defeat them. The corrective fleet drifted in the darkness. 10,000 ships waited for orders that would never come. And on Earth, humanity watched the stars and prepared for whatever came next. The war had only just begun. 48 hours remained when the council delegation landed on Earth. High Arbiter Vexthil stepped off his shuttle onto the grounds of the United Earth Government headquarters in Geneva. He was accompanied by military observers from 6 different council species. All of them were eager to witness another primitive world submit to the natural order of the galaxy. The ceremony was being broadcast across all council worlds. This was standard practice. Every conquered species watched as new ones surrendered. It reminded them of their place. It showed them that resistance was futile. Billions of aliens across thousands of planets watched their screens and waited for Earth to kneel. The Grand Assembly Hall was filled with representatives from every nation on Earth. They sat in silence as Vexthil and his delegation took their seats at the front of the room. The High Arbiter looked out at the crowd of humans with something like pity in his 4 gray eyes. He had seen this moment so many times before. The fear, the desperation, the final acceptance of defeat. Secretary General Paul Griffin walked slowly to the podium. He was dressed in a simple dark suit with no medals or decorations. He looked like an ordinary old man about to give an ordinary speech. The cameras focused on his face. Every alien in the galaxy expected to see tears or fear or desperate pleading. Griffin looked down at the single piece of paper in his hands. He read the words clearly and calmly. The people of Earth respectfully decline your generous offer and wish you safe travels home. Then he laughed. It was not a nervous laugh or a bitter laugh. It was warm and genuine, the kind of laugh shared between old friends at a good joke. The sound spread through the human delegation like a wave. Diplomats and generals and politicians all began to smile and chuckle. Vexthel sat frozen in his seat. His 4 eyes blinked rapidly as his mind tried to process what was happening. This was not possible. This had never happened before. In 10,000 years of council history, no species had ever refused. No species had ever laughed. The High Arbiter rose to his feet and demanded to know if humans understood the consequences of their decision. His voice echoed through the silent hall. He spoke of the corrective fleet that waited beyond their solar system. He spoke of the destruction of their colonies. He spoke of the extinction of their entire species. Griffin waited patiently for him to finish. Then he responded in the same calm voice he had used before. Humanity understood the consequences perfectly. They simply did not care. Ambassador Daniel Webb stepped forward from the crowd. He carried a small device in his hand that projected images into the air above the assembly. He began to show evidence that humanity had not been idle during their years in space. He showed secret meetings with representatives of the Vethari remnant. He showed supply shipments to Kaldan resistance fighters. He showed encrypted communications with 17 different species that the Council had conquered or oppressed. A new figure entered the hall. Commander Rachel Torres was 34 years old, with short dark hair and eyes that had seen too much suffering. She had spent 15 years living in disguise on Council worlds. She had built networks of informants and saboteurs across hegemony space. She had watched species suffer under Council rule and promised them that help was coming. Now she stood before the most powerful beings in the galaxy and told them what she had done. She described the resistance cells waiting for activation on 100 worlds. She explained the weaknesses in Council technology that humanity had discovered. She listed the names of species ready to rise up if given the chance. Vexthel listened with growing horror. Everything he believed about the galaxy was crumbling around him. The Council was supposed to be invincible. Lesser species were supposed to submit and obey. This was the natural order that had governed the galaxy for 10,000 years. Griffin stepped forward again with a new offer. Humanity did not want war. They did not want to rule the galaxy. They wanted something much simpler. They wanted the Council to leave Earth and its colonies alone. They wanted negotiations for a new galactic order where all species were treated as equals. They wanted to end the cycle of conquest and submission that had defined civilization for millennia. The Council observers looked at each other with confusion and anger. The Zendari delegate whispered urgently to the hegemony observers. The Vethari military attaché sat in stunned silence, his scaled face unreadable. Vexthel began to laugh. It was a harsh sound like metal scraping against stone. He called humanity's offer a bluff. He said their threats were empty and their alliances were worthless. He declared that the corrective fleet would advance immediately. Earth would burn, and its ashes would remind the galaxy of the price of defiance. He gave the order. Somewhere beyond the solar system, 10,000 warships began to move toward Earth. Griffin nodded sadly. His old eyes held no fear, only a deep disappointment. He had hoped the Council would choose differently. He had hoped they would see reason. But he had known all along that this moment probably come. He activated Protocol Defiance Phase 2. Across Council space, encrypted signals reached their destinations. Resistance cells that had been waiting for years received their orders. Vethari technicians who worked in hegemony shipyards began their sabotage. Kaldan laborers who maintained critical infrastructure started their quiet rebellion. 100 small fires began to burn throughout the Empire. Commander Torres smiled for the first time in years. The galaxy was about to learn something it had forgotten. Power was not measured in ships and weapons. Power came from hope. And humanity had just given hope to billions of oppressed beings across 1,000 worlds. Vexthal stormed out of the assembly hall with his delegation close behind. His shuttle lifted off within minutes and raced back to his crystalline ship. He began issuing orders to the corrective fleet, demanding status updates and arrival times. But even as he gave commands, something felt wrong. Communications were delayed. Reports were garbled. Systems that had worked perfectly for centuries were suddenly unreliable. He did not yet understand what was happening. He did not know that the war had already begun. Griffin watched the alien shuttle disappear into the sky. He felt tired but strangely peaceful. Whatever happened next, humanity had made its choice. They had refused to surrender. They had offered friendship instead of submission. They had given the galaxy a different vision of what civilization could be. Now they would see if that vision could survive.